So if you guys don't mind, we're going to be trying something a little bit different today, a little bit more laid back. So laid back, in fact, that I'm not even really sure what I'm going to say that this video is going to be about, other than I kind of have been thinking recently about doing just sort of the generic commentary that a lot of other political and, commentary channels do. And I don't want to get too much into, the sort of parasocial relationship that some content creators have with their followers, because I've never really liked that. I feel like that, gets too personal. I know it sounds sappy, but I really don't like the idea of people watching me and being like, oh, I enjoy his content, and just someday having me be like, oh, well, you're an idiot. You should shut up, And if that isn't also an indicator, I wouldn't say I'm not polite. I'm just not very social. So maybe this can be a series where if you guys want to ask me questions, I can answer them. But for now, I have something that I've sort of asked you guys about before in the past, and you seem to be somewhat interested in this, which is that I get a lot of comments that are just, it's just absolute brain rot. And these comments have helped me to realize that society is dying, basically. And I think when I say things like that, a lot of you probably think that that's a bit melodramatic. And so what I've talked about before in the past, and what I figured I'd do here, is I would just go ahead and show you guys the comments that I have to deal with, until eventually, video after video, you guys get black-pilled into realizing, wow, there really is no hope for humanity anymore. But before we get to that, let's go ahead and get right into the news! I don't know why I tried to do a Keemstar reference as a joke. Wasn't really... I didn't even commit is the worst part. I don't know if this is going to be a recurring thing if I actually make more videos like this, because as much as this may come as a surprise, I'm not all too interested in politics, if that makes any sense. I think I've covered this before in the past, where I'm sort of just a very normie reactionary person. My interest in politics is that there are a lot of crazy people now, and I don't want them running the world. But other than that, I could not care less about what's going on in the world and the bureaucracy of our government. So unless in any given week or any given month, how often I do this, there is a story that's actually very important, I don't know how much I can pretend to have any interest in what's going on in the world. For example, did you guys hear that there was an election and Donald Trump won?
I'm gonna come.
That's cool, I guess. I mean, as I've said before in the past, I have sort of mixed feelings on that. For one, when they killed that squirrel, which if you don't know, there was a squirrel that some guy owned, and then a New York Department of Environmental Conservation came in and euthanized his pet squirrel for no reason in particular, really. But when they euthanized that squirrel and everyone got upset about government overreach, I should have invested in Bitcoin. I wasn't sure if Trump would win or not, but the moment that happened, I was like, you know what? He has a good chance. And I should have invested in Bitcoin. I would have been so rich right now. I thought about it too, but I just didn't even do it. I'm an idiot. I don't know why I didn't do it. But yeah, other than that, I don't think there's really been much news. There hasn't really been many riots yet. I think typically those happen around inauguration. So we'll have to see how that turns out. But as of right now, there's really just Democrats doing what Democrats do best, being shady, treasonous dogs. This is why I have mixed feelings about this election, because it's sure, he won all 7 swing states, he won the popular vote. But at the same time, you had her, and she won 47% of the vote? That's crazy. And that's just a sign of where we are as a country. Because perhaps more interesting news, it seems like it was a state representative from North Carolina. In Congress, he's floating the idea of a shadow cabinet. You know how for years leftists have made fun of us and been like, oh, you're conspiracy theorists for believing in the deep state and shadow governments, even though we believe in the bourgeoisie. But now here you literally have a Democrat proposing a shadow government. The idea here would basically be to install their own cabinet of people to just counteract whatever Donald Trump's administration would do. And I'm pretty sure that's just explicitly treason. I mean, let me read this here, because I'm trying to see if this is supposed to be like the shadow cabinet is in committees, because I guess you could kind of do that. Nichols said U.S. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Senate Leader Chuck Schumer could appoint 26 Democratic members of Congress to go one-to-one with each member of Trump's cabinet. It's really easy, Nichols said. It's a communications push. It's about putting out our positive message to counter what we're seeing from Trump. And if Trump or his cabinet secretaries step out of line, we've got somebody ready to go and answer and be accountable to the American people on things we care about. So, I mean, at least from these quotes, hopefully they're just intending this to be, what's the word? Basically like how sometimes our government just goes, no, bad. So yeah, either performative activism or treason, really. Because I'm pretty sure what, he's saying here with stepping out of line, it's more of the judicial branch's responsibilities to interpret the law and say, hey, you're enforcing it incorrectly. The legislative branch is only supposed to write laws. And I don't even know how they think they're going to do this unless they're trying to pass it before, the end of this session. Because Democrats lost the House, they lost the Senate. A little more alarming from Democrats, however, in Pennsylvania, you have, in Bucks County, commissioners vote to count illegal ballots as Pennsylvania Senate race heads for recount.
We reject all three categories of these ballots.
Your motion is to reject or dismiss the challenges in this category in front of you?
Correct, yep.
Not going to second that, mostly because I think we all know that precedent by a court doesn't matter anymore in this country, and people violate laws anytime they want. So for me, if I violate this law, it's because I want a court to pay attention to it.
If I violate this law, I want a court to pay attention to it. That's wild. You gotta love it when the people in power are just saying, well, the law doesn't matter anymore, so, I'm going to violate this law so that way people pay attention to me. How hard is it when you lost an election and, you lose somewhat badly? I wouldn't say, in a landslide. I mean, yes, Trump did win all 7 swing states, and we did gain a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate, and that is really good considering how tight these races typically are. But how can you lose that badly and have pretty much everybody tell you it's because you have candidates who are far too radical, who do not care about law and order, and then just look at that and go, nah, I'm gonna keep trying it. I don't want to be an alarmist, because at least right now it seems like a lot of this is more talk than anything else. But this is what I have been alluding to for years now. There is no point in civility when the other side doesn't want to be civil. When they lose an election and then they just turn around and, as I've seen some people accuse us of cheating, even though, we accused them last time and that was ridiculous. Don't we know that these elections are secure? Until, of course, we win and then they're no longer secure. We cheated. I mean, just what do you guys think is the resolution to this? Because I think Donald Trump really needs to be the dictator that everybody is worried that he's going to be. Because I don't think that any of this is going to end until the people in power realize that they can't just do whatever they want. And so if they are going to try to usurp the natural process of power, Donald Trump should come in and say, hey, you're going to go to prison for treason. That's just where I'm at. I don't want to say violence, but I think serious, forceful action is necessary to finally shake people out of this delusion. Because it's clear that having civil conversations, going through the democratic process, that's not working. Because we can beat them in that way, and then they're still like this. They don't get the message. So again, not violence, but people don't seem to understand that there's a middle ground between just live and let me hope that this doesn't become a problem, and violent civil war and violent resistance. There is just law and order. 30 to 40 years ago, we used to forcefully institutionalize people. McCarthy era, we put communists in prison. I know if a lot of you watch all of my videos, you're probably getting tired of hearing me say this over and over again, but it really needs to be emphasized. There is a clear, common sense solution here. Stop allowing people who don't want others to have a seat at the table to have a seat at the table. It's the tolerance paradox. They are just going to abuse your tolerance to make an intolerant system. And so, yeah, that's That's what I think, and that's kind of why I don't like to talk about the news, because it's always just going to come back to this same lecture, really. Because, for example, when we apply this policy to our adversaries on a foreign battlefield, and Donald Trump leads through strength, well, then suddenly the night that he becomes president-elect, our enemies all kneel before us. Like, you had Russia saying they're ready to have talks about ending the Ukraine war. You had China talking about how they wanted to normalize relations with the US. You had the Houthis saying, oh, well, let's have a ceasefire. You had Hamas saying, oh, well, let's have a ceasefire. It's because Donald Trump leads through strength. I mean, there's all these videos where he's talking about, I have a bigger button than you, and here's your house, I'm going to blow you up. And again, we don't need to use that rhetoric against our fellow Americans, right? But we do need to realize that, like, hey, if we took even like a tenth of that and said, hey, if you're going to break the law, we're just going to throw you into prison, they would probably calm down a whole lot. Because right now we're basically just giving into the temper tantrum of a child. And we need to not do that. So anyways, in more important news, North Korea soldiers hooked on porn in Russia. When I first saw this in my feed, I can't tell you how much I laughed. The world is wild. Also, apparently Mike Tyson lost to Jake Paul, which I think pretty much everyone can agree that that was probably rigged then. So to cheer us all up, here is a video of Mike Tyson playing with a grown man who has a genetic disorder that makes him look like a little toddler. and he just didn't know. My sense of humor is impeccable. Anyways, time for another twist in this roller coaster of emotions. Let's go to the comments that I think will crush your soul. This first comment here was left on a video where I was talking about sort of the complacency that we have for thinking that certain things are historical events. And I don't just mean in the past, I mean, there's recently been a trend of people saying, oh, well, I'm sick of living through historical events. And so this first comment reads, I can understand the point you're trying to make, but I think you may be missing part of it. If you're talking about historical events in the context of making history, me making a PB&J qualifies because it's an event that happened in time. If you use historical events when referring to something like the pandemic, where millions of people died and entire countries were locked down, or a civil war were to erupt, or World War III started, or seeing what's going on in the Middle East, those would be events that end up in textbooks and get taught to future generations. Those are the types of events people are sick of living through. Okay, so here's a good reason why we're reading these comments too. Not only, do you get to see how I respond to arguments, you get to understand kind of like the extent to which people make bad arguments. Not to say that this at face value is like necessarily brain rot, but you also get to learn valuable lessons here. On how to make arguments. So, advice that I can give all of you is when you are arguing with someone, don't intentionally think that they're an idiot. Some people, yes, are idiots, so you're going to have to think that sometimes. But don't go around to people who probably aren't idiots and just assume that they're idiots and make an argument to make yourself feel smarter because you're attacking a position that isn't true and is really ignorant. Like, what am I supposed to do when I look at this comment? Go, oh, things that happened in the past are historical events? I didn't know that. Thank you. I did miss that part. No, I didn't miss that part. That's not something I'm missing. I understand that if you do something and then it transpires in the past because, time is moving, then it is a historical event in so much as it is an event that happened in the past. And I also understand that, things like this will be taught in future generations' history courses. But for example, when it's this comment or this other comment that reads, don't think people are talking about current events as historical events because we think history is unchangeable, but because of the significance those events have in our lives, and we presume that these events are significant enough to be taught in future history classes. I would also pedantically argue that history is unchangeable because history is in the past and the past is also unchangeable. In both of these, they're attacking something that is no duh, and by virtue of that, they're missing the point. I mean, for example, in this comment, this person is saying, well, we're not saying this because it's unchangeable, but also the past is unchangeable. And so you've actually accidentally stumbled into my argument, even though you think my argument is wrong. It is a psychoanalytical argument. What I'm saying is that we are taking a perspective in thinking about this that doesn't really make sense. You're thinking about it not as something that you're living through, but as something that is going to be in the past from a future perspective. That is kind of like a defense mechanism. You are distancing yourself from the event. For example, it would be just as true to say that events that are currently happening are events that would have happened from a past perspective. But people don't really say, oh, I hate that we're living through things that will have had people don't really think about it like that because that doesn't make any sense. And so no, I'm not missing the point. You guys are missing the point by having like very annoyingly pedantic arguments that don't actually touch on what I'm saying. As you point out here in this comment, history is unchangeable. We don't give ourselves agency in current events. Very often you will see this mentality that, oh, well, that's not going to happen because progress, basically, is the argument. When you see current events as just being historical and unchangeable and not really a part of our lives, then you become complacent in those events. Moving on, these comments are from a video where I talked about how populism is a problem that the left doesn't want to address. Because when we talk about the far right, what we're really talking about is the populist right. And populism is a big issue among leftists. You know, there's the woke mob. Basically, everything is about the tyranny of the majority. Whatever the mob wants, that's what's right. And so they don't address the actual problem in right-wing politics, which is populism. So here we have a word that certain platforms don't like, but you can read it here, is not a problem in leftist circles. I guess I read that wrong. Is not a problem in leftist circles. Hello? Same word. Hates socialists and communists. Lamau. Yes. Because, like, you can never hate people that are slightly different than you. That's impossible, right? It's always the same absurd arguments. Especially here for, you know, this group. Because, for example, Stanley G. Payne gave a definition of fascism, which is the three negations. It is anti-liberal, anti-communist, yes, but it is also anti-conservative. And of note here, anti-liberal, when historians are talking about liberalism, they're actually talking about classical liberalism, and that is sort of the belief system of like the founding fathers, of which we know that many conservatives at least believe that they derive their beliefs from. So those three negations actually read like anti-right-wing, anti-libertarian right-wing, and anti-communist. Benito Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile, the founders of fascism, were both former socialists. And so sure, at face value, they called themselves the National Socialists isn't a good argument for whether or not these people were right-wing or left-wing. But taken into consideration of like every other historical fact that you can read up on, they were essentially socialists, and they only hated socialists and communists because they were their political opposition. There's a little more nuance to that. I think it would probably be fairer to say that they are third positionist, and you could even argue that it was less like state socialism and more like state corporatism. But another negation, and I don't know if it's like from Stanley G. Payne or Umberto Eco, is anti-capitalist. Like, you're just approaching this from a historical revisionist lens in which, oh, everybody tells you that they were far right, so they must be far right, and so that's not a problem within leftist circles. No, it absolutely is. And like the only argument I've ever seen people make as to why they were actually far right is like, oh, they were very, and what's the word people always use? Because they're always talking about how they had a strong sense of moral value, which is real crazy to say about that group of people. But what they really mean is that they have a belief in enforcing their views onto others, which is one, crazy because it basically means that leftist ideology is when you don't have moral values and you don't actually like have any convictions that you stand for morally. And then also that just conflates like the very egoistic moral values of the modern right, the idea that they put themselves first, their country first, their family first, because they care about themselves and they are individualistic, versus the collectivist nature of believing in like the greatness of your nation and doing everything for your race or your country, your people. And that's just not an attitude that many conservatives really have. And so it's just frustrating that you guys will come along and be like, oh, but what about Richard Spencer and those Tiki Torch guys when they called themselves Unite the Right? You know, when the National Socialists call themselves socialist, that isn't evidence that they're socialists. But when Unite the Right calls themselves the right, that means that that's the right. Like, no, it clearly doesn't. And if you actually brush up on that recent history, Richard Spencer, for example, was ostracized by the right. He voted for Joe Biden, a former segregationist, which many people forget. Joe Biden was a former segregationist. The most recent crazy who believed in this said that he was voting for Joe Biden because, and I quote, he sends rockets to Ukraine. Really, the only characteristic of this group that you could probably attribute to conservatives is populism. But of course, that was the point of the video that you left this copium on, so I guess you're not going to address that whatsoever, because you don't know history. Also on this same video, you are presenting left and right merely as collectivism versus individualism, because for all intents and purposes, that's what the left-right dichotomy is. It is possible to have individualist progressives or collectivist conservatives. Not really. The first one maybe, but as I just mentioned, conservatives derive their beliefs from the founding fathers, from Enlightenment-era philosophers, and that is classical liberalism. And classical liberalism is individualistic. Here's the definition of conservative from Oxford. Conservative in a political context favoring free enterprise, private ownership, and socially traditional ideas. So the socially traditional ideas in the context of America is again classical liberalism, individualism. And especially for American conservatives, it's rugged individualism, something you should have learned about in a history class. And so also here, private ownership. Conservatives are not going to collectivize anything economically because that's against private ownership. So realistically, no collectivist conservatives do not exist. That doesn't make any sense. The more a conservative collectivizes the public good, the more you go from conservatism as a derivation of classical liberalism to social liberalism as a derivation of classical liberalism. And so maybe you're approaching this from the perspective that many people do naively. Oh, liberalism isn't left-wing, and so you think that like liberals are conservatives. But no, liberals are not conservatives, they're left-wing. Basically, anything outside of the realm of classical liberalism should not be humored as a political ideology. It's just a mental illness. Being a Marxist is a mental illness. Fascism is universally recognized as far-right. No, it is not. Historical revisionists like yourself have changed it to mean far-right, but just because a bunch of people online say that it's far-right doesn't mean that it is. Yet it recognized no rights for its citizens. Historically, it was just right-wing socialism. And, like, if you guys were trying to defend this person and you're like, oh, well, actually, yes, it is far right. Like, look at this. In one sentence, you say that fascism is universally recognized as far right. In the next, you utter an oxymoron like right-wing socialism. And, you know, not necessarily an oxymoron in all contexts, because obviously I agree that it is right-wing socialism insofar as it is a derivation of socialism that goes further to the right. And you could make the argument, rightfully so, that because of that, you could say it's not socialism, right? I'll give you guys that. Like, I don't want to try to nitpick and argue about things that are very, very nuanced and should be up to opinion. But you can't say that it is far right and then turn around and say that it is right of socialism. That's just insane. You are a lunatic. And would you be surprised to know that this person commented on another video? Because unsurprisingly, when people have very bad opinions, they typically think that they're very good opinions. And so I get stuff like this where this other person is responding to like several people, and I wonder if he's trying to have productive conversations with all of them. No, he's absolutely not. He's just insane. And this is what I go through every day, which isn't, you know, boohoo, woe is me. I just delete the comments, block the person, and move on. But, like, hopefully this is what I mean by, like, blackpilling you guys. You can see that a lot of these people are just crazy. They don't know what they're talking about, and their opinions do not deserve to be respected. So back to this one guy. This is on another video of mine where I talk about how people misappropriate the concept of fairness. It is a moral concept, and it cannot be applied to something that is not a moral actor, like the world, like life. Life is just a material thing. It's existence. It can't be moral. And so here he says, your claim is a straw man. No reasonable person believes that the motions of inanimate objects are immoral, nor is consequentialism based on that principle. Okay, I never said that it was. When people complain that life isn't fair, at worst they are suggesting that human beings have a moral duty to act when hardship befalls others. Being responsible for the consequences of inactions may lead to logical absurdities. And then here is like, you always know that when people say stuff like this, they have the best intentions at heart. As an aside, you are speaking too quickly and using jargon obfuscation to anyone who actually needed to hear your message. You are also coming off as condescending and a bit pretentious. I wonder why. Could it possibly be because I have to deal with people like this on a daily basis? I used to be pretty humble, actually. I know it's a bit of a contradiction to say that you're humble. At least people think that it is, because humility is actually just knowing your place and knowing your value. And so if anything, knowing that you're good, but not too good, that's being humble. But I used to be humble until I had to deal with this every day. And I'm like, I don't want to be nice to these people. First and foremost, another lesson here to learn. Anytime someone makes an argument against something that is not your steel man of the argument, anytime someone makes an argument against something that is not your interpretation, what you think is a good and reasonable interpretation of an argument, that doesn't make it a straw man. I can argue against people who get things obscenely wrong. If you say no reasonable person believes that the motions of inanimate objects are immoral, well then here's an answer to why I'm being condescending then. By your own admission, I'm not talking to reasonable people. You can't just decide that I have to be criticizing reasonable people. I don't want to criticize reasonable people. I want to criticize people who are detached from reality, because I think reasonable people should be allowed to have free and open discussions. I just hate crazy people. So no, it's not a straw man, because as we'll get to, I don't even think that your claims are really true here. And then it is also funny that in the same paragraph you accuse me of straw manning. You also then go on to say that consequentialism is only based on the consequence of inanimate objects. No, I'm saying that the only way you can view inanimate objects as having moral capabilities is by viewing the morality of the consequences they produce. Because obviously we can't look at that through a deontological perspective, because objects don't have an obligation to act or not act in certain ways. And I think we're going to come back to that with the drowning child, because you just don't really understand morality, apparently. The point is that inanimate objects can only produce consequences. And so you have to be looking at morality through consequentialism in order to say that objects are moral or immoral. When people complain that life isn't fair, at worst they are suggesting that human beings have a moral duty to act when hardships befall others. No, that's just what you're saying. Because as you say here, people tend to suggest that others have an obligation to act based on those material conditions. Like, don't get me wrong, obviously, if a woman has a miscarriage, that is an awful thing, because we can approach that from an egoistic perspective and we can say that was harmful, it was traumatic for you. But I think that's like controversially the element that I'm trying to get here. If somebody has a miscarriage, what is my obligation to act? I mean, yes, it's moral to comfort them and give your condolences, but there isn't an action available to the person. And I mean, even in explaining all of this, we're really getting away from what the point of the video even was. The idea that people say life isn't fair. You can't just watch a video in which I say that, you can't attribute fairness to life because life is neither fair nor unfair, and then say, actually, this is what life isn't fair means, and so let me argue this instead. Because in this, you would have to concede that sure, they can mean something by it, and this meaning can be more reasonable or less reasonable, but then at the very least you're conceding that the statement itself at face value isn't true, and that's the point of the video. I mean, literally at the end, I say that it isn't about life being fair or not, it's about whether or not, for example, social norms violate other ethical principles like causing harm. And here you are saying, well, life isn't fair is about other ethical principles. So there you go. And I frankly don't even know where you're talking about being responsible for the consequences of inactions may lead to logical absurdities. I don't think I ever talked about the consequences of inaction leading to logical absurdities. I talked about viewing things from an absolute consequentialist perspective leading to logical absurdities. Because, for example, as I alluded to earlier, when we get to the drowning child here, you could say that a person has an obligation to act. You don't have to view it through the consequences of the action. Because, for example, if I was there in front of the child, we could say that I have an obligation to act. But if I was halfway across the world, how would I know that the child is there? And so how would I have an obligation to act? These are two different scenarios through a perspective that involves obligation. But when we're just looking through consequence, whether I'm there or not there, in either circumstance, the child dies. That's the problem, is consequentialism versus deontology. And so here with your last paragraph, talking too quickly, well, that's because it's a 1-minute video, I have to. Using jargon obfuscation, not sure what jargon I was using besides deontology and consequentialism. And again, it's a 1-minute video, so I don't have time to explain what consequentialism is and what deontology is. If you guys want me to explain it here, consequentialism is looking at the, you guessed it, consequences of an action in order to determine whether or not it's moral. Deontology is a little more complicated, but roughly speaking, it's just looking at what obligation you have to act or not act. So if you think that those are big words that I'm obfuscating my message with, and you think I'm being condescending, maybe I'm not using big words, maybe I'm not being condescending, maybe you just don't know what you're talking about, and you find it off-putting. You don't like that you're not intelligent enough to participate in a conversation like this. So again, you guys can call that condescending, but actual humility would be realizing that, and then not participating in that conversation. Also from that same video, disagree, apples are not comparable to life and the experience that any given individual has. Instead, life is not fair and fair doesn't exist. Just as cold doesn't exist. Fairness could be considered perfection, as in everything would have to be perfectly balanced and all things fair. Even if life is 1% unfair, it's unfair, so it nulls out any fairness. Thus, fairness doesn't exist. That is such a prick response, honestly. Because ultimately you agree, albeit through a different means, with my conclusion that life is not fair. And so your only reason with disagreeing with me is that you disagree with the means by which I arrive at that conclusion, and your rebuttal to that is, apples are not comparable to life and the experience that any given individual has. I don't think you understood the video. I wasn't talking about life like Phoebe, and not from Friends, the Greek word meaning like quality of life. Or is it Phoebos? I don't know. You can Google it. I was talking about life as in the world, the universe, material conditions. So material things are comparable to material things, and you're just a pseudo-intellectual who can't understand what I'm saying. This next comment is from my video on how determinism is a flawed and baseless ideology. I find this rather unconvincing, but what's funny is that you and I seem to be in the possession of most of the same considerations and angles on the subject and come to the opposite conclusions. Did I read that right? But what's funny is that you and I seem to be in the possession of most of the same considerations and angles on the subject and come to the opposite conclusions. Yeah, I think I read that right. At 8:10, you talk about how this lack of free will that the figure on the right asserts is just a pedantic reframing of compatibilism as determinism. But I see it as pointing out that compatibilism is a vain attempt to argue that a deterministic universe yet allows for free will, appealing to the concept of compatibilism, which I think is, as Alex O'Connor puts it, a word game. So instantly for me, you lose 10 points by referencing Alex O'Connor as if he's an intellectual. But then after that, pretty much all I have to say about this comment is that this is just a lot like the performative contradiction that subjectivists constantly run into. A subjectivist will say, oh, well, all interpretations are valid, except for yours. And so here, if you're saying that it's a word game, why are you participating in it? I mean, I could be reading this wrong because you could just have said that compatibilism is not possible and you didn't really give an argument for it. But at least as I read this, and especially how you say that we're coming to the same considerations and angles on the subject, I think pedantic determinists are making an argument where there needs to be none. And that's why I kind of, passive-aggressively refer to them as pedantic determinists and sort of put them down a little bit. Because I suppose this is on me in some capacity because I didn't really elaborate on this too much, but I think pedantic determinists are basically correct. And so that's why I attack them for being pedantic, because they believe all the same things that I believe, that you believe, that this person believes, but then they just want to play a word game and then say, oh, well, actually, then free will doesn't exist. And so, like, the annoying part here is that I'm saying they're playing a word game and I concede that they're right in what they believe, but I challenge them for how they present their arguments because it's intellectually dishonest, and then you do something similar, but you don't really address the intellectual dishonesty. You're just saying, well, no, they're wrong. You can't acknowledge that it's a word game and then play the word game. I acknowledge that it's a word game. I say that they're right for what they say, but they need to not play the word game and just acknowledge that they're compatibilists, because they're not really using the common parlance definitions of free will and of compatibilism and of determinism. And if they did, and they were just being honest about their beliefs and their opinions, then they would call themselves compatibilists. And so yeah, this just like, it annoys me, because it's like, you can't say, oh, well, everyone's definitions are equally valid, and we need to not play word games, we need to get to the heart of the matter, and then play word games. Really, the only way out of that, where you can play word games and you can have the high ground, is when you say, okay, well, this is the definition by consensus. And that is what I'm doing. The vast majority of philosophers are compatibilists. We look at how they define compatibilism, and pedantic determinists are compatibilists. This is from a video where I talked about how Islam is not really an Abrahamic religion because it rejects what came before it. Here we have, yet all other Abrahamic beliefs rejected what comes after. And this is like what most comments are like. I'm actually a little disappointed because so far, the comments that I've been taking from like this week and prior weeks, they've had some almost decent criticisms. I mean, often it's just misrepresentations of what I said, or just people not really engaging with what I said. But this is what most comments are usually like. Not engaging with what I said, and just doesn't even make sense. I don't even know what point you think you could be trying to make such that I could engage with it. Like, yes, all Abrahamic beliefs rejected what came after. But the point is, if they reject what came before, then they're not continuing the tradition of the beliefs that came before them. And so Islam doesn't do that, other religions do, and so Islam isn't like these other religions. It's pretty simple. And finally, for negative comments on my video, these are from a video where I talked about basically what I said at the beginning, except in this video I went a little more into how, like, for example, Kamala Harris conceded the election to a fascist. And not only that, but she congratulated a fascist. Isn't that a little weird that it's the end of the world if he wins until he wins, and then it's just life as usual for these people who told us that it was going to be the end of the world? And so of course here we get the comment, you know that Trump would never be that nice if he lost. And then a separate comment from the same person, even though he cheated to win, if he lost, he would say it was stolen and they cheated. And there you go. What did I say at the beginning? If we lose and we say that they cheated, they didn't, and that's crazy. If they lose, then it's because we cheated. And that actually reminds me, I did get one comment on a video. The thing that bugs me as much as anything, and I know that all the votes aren't counted, how many less votes than 2020? Like, I can't grasp that many fewer votes. Like 1 million I can, but as of now, 11 million or more? This emoji? I think that's supposed to be or more, right? Because that's X less than. And I've been thinking about this recently, so I wanted to see exactly what the votes ended up being. 73 million, 76 million. So that's about 150 million. 2020 number of votes. The Federal Election Commission reports that 158 million people voted in the 2020 presidential election. So that's only, what, a difference of 8 million? So I think this probably came down to the votes not having been counted yet. Because I would have been all on board with this conspiracy theory, because, you know, back in 2020, I fell asleep thinking that Donald Trump was going to win, and then I woke up finding out that Biden had won overnight at like 3 o'clock in the morning. And we all saw the spike in votes. And so I understand the skepticism. Literally, as I said earlier in the video, I didn't bet on Trump because in the back of my mind I thought, well, what if they cheat? Because all of the signs that I was seeing culturally were implying that Donald Trump was going to win, but I'm like, last time a former segregationist who lost his mind during his presidency became the president somehow. And so I didn't really have faith in the system, for obvious reasons. But isn't it a good thing now that we can look back and say that 2020 was probably a fair election? Unfortunately, I guess that's not good, because then that means people elected a former segregationist, and they almost elected that woman. But, where was I going with this, that this was a good thing? I didn't know what to think of the results of the 2020 election either. And I think that's just due to the fact that it was such an unprecedented election, but then the Democrats, being the sore losers and sore winners that they are, when they won, they just gaslit America into thinking that everything was completely normal, that like it wasn't an unprecedented election in which it is reasonable for people to think that it was unprecedented. And so I wish that they would have been a little more, understanding in that regard, because then you wouldn't have people who feel so disenfranchised. But I think now that he won, and now that we saw that this many people just are voting, apparently, I mean, that is if that news article I saw can be trusted, then I'm gonna have to skip out on you guys with this one. Any other conspiracy theory, like January 6th? I'm still there with you, but this one, it seems like maybe it was a fair election, and America is just that manipulated by the Democratic Party. Although I suppose you could argue that 2020 means that 2024 was just too big to rig, and they did try, and maybe that could give you faith in humanity, because then you could say, oh, well, actually, nobody really voted for her. But I don't know. I don't really see people not cheating enough, you know? Like, if you're gonna cheat, commit to it then. I don't think there is such a thing as too big to rig, because a lot of the information coming out now, they knew that they were going to lose. You had Polymarket, you had even, I believe the claim was that someone in her campaign had them losing by like 400 something. I mean, the writing was on the wall, because you had all of the authentic Trump support, and then you had all of the AI images that her campaign put out. So you would have to imagine that they knew that they weren't very popular, and they would have known by how much to adjust that. So make of that what you will, you know. I'm still a little sympathetic to things like this, because, for example, in 2020, was it the Washington Post or the New York Post? I think it was the Washington Post, put out an article about a shadow campaign, and they were like, yeah, these Republican in-name-only rhinos and Democrats got together to make sure that Donald Trump would lose. And they secured democracy. And it's like, okay, but like, when other people do that, you call that election interference. But when there's literally like a shadow organization that made sure Trump lost in 2020, we're supposed to say that that was a fair election. So I don't doubt that there is some funny business, but I think this should put our minds at ease a little bit maybe. But at the same time, don't be at ease. Always be aware, and don't let anyone pull anything over on you. But speaking of that shadow campaign, I saw a funny post today. Liberals, if we could just jail Trump, get rid of MAGA in the Electoral College, stack the Supreme Court, ban voter ID, and censor free speech, we could save democracy. Have you seen that one? That's a good one. Finally, now I have one last thing I want to share, because I think those comments didn't really sum up just how doomed we are as a society. So I think this comment is actually pretty interesting. I saw it on a post, I believe, by Courier, since that's what that says right there on the infographic. Which, before we even get to the comment, regardless of if you're on the left or if you're on the right, can we all agree that this is a horrible representation of data? Like, I have no idea what I am looking at here. And you can look at me and you can think, oh, you're an idiot. It's clear what you're looking at here. It says right down there, red arrows indicate rightward shifts, blue indicate left. Okay, but like, look at the southwest coast of Texas. You see that there's a small arrow right there, right? Now look at the southeast coast of Texas. You see these really long, big arrows. And so the problem with this graph is that you're looking at like Kentucky and that area right there, and you're thinking like, oh, well, that's a lot of shifting to the right. It's like, no, that's just a place where there are smaller counties. More arrows doesn't mean shifting more to the right, because as we see, longer arrows are more of a shift to the right. More arrows just means more counties in that region. This is a horrible graph, because you're supposed to be looking at the length of the arrows. I can't look at the length of the arrows, because you just have them all cluttered together there. Just like go county by county with like red. More red is more right-leaning. More blue is more left-leaning. Don't try to put arrows. I can't read this. But anyways, the horrible comment here, and this, I think actually I should have left the like ratio on this. This is, I think, the most liked comment on this video with like, I can't remember if it was 1,000 likes or 100,000 likes. I'm actually shocked at how Trump was able to beat Harris when she had 0 large controversies and relatively populist policies, won the debate, and was VP in an economic boom. I think this person wrote boon, but boom, relative to the world. Let's start with that last one first, because that's the easiest. She was VP after a pandemic. That's the economic boom, is coming back from a pandemic that they more or less caused. Obviously, they aren't responsible for COVID, but they're responsible for the lockdowns. And so we haven't, like, come back all too much. We just came back from really, really bad to less bad. And so now just top down, 0 large controversies? Where do you come from with this? Is your definition of a controversy, specifically a large controversy, just in a very traditional view. Like, oh, she didn't have Monica Lewinsky in the Oval Office. So it's not a large controversy. The president that she was VP under called half of Americans garbage. The Call Her Daddy podcast, sure, that wasn't a large controversy, but even Democrats thought that that was in poor taste. People were dead and dying from a natural disaster that, again, many people forget this, but the executive branch has the power to do more in natural disasters. Bush, for example, was ridiculed for doing nothing during Katrina, and at least he signed several executive orders. Harris did literally nothing but give people a loan that they had to pay back, a loan that many of them weren't even given. That was a very large controversy, because again, not saving people who are dying. And if we want to talk about large controversies, there is how Joe Biden pulled out of Afghanistan. That embarrassment that killed a lot of people. That's a huge controversy. What are you talking about? Zero controversies, relatively populist, and there we go. That kind of explains it all. You're a lunatic. You think populism is a good thing. You think mob rule is a good thing. You're just a full-blown leftist lunatic. Won the debate. Literally nobody but the Harris campaign has ever said that. And so just like, it's insane how detached from reality these people are. Because here's the first response. I'll help you understand. She's a woman. It's uncomfortably that simple in this disgusting country. No, it's because she recommended policies like price controls on food that, like, even the left-wing media had to call her out for. They were like, hey, this is what the USSR did, and it caused famine and starvation. She lied about working at McDonald's. She faked a photo. Her campaign was constantly using AI and manipulating the public with like provably false information. I don't know how in your pathetic little mind that comes down to, oh, she's just a woman and that's it. Trump doesn't call the other side, doesn't call his opponent the mustache man. Relative to the world, lol. The rest of the world is just crisis run by idiots. It absolutely is. I mean, like, I'm sick and tired, too, of seeing so many people be like, oh, well, this policy worked in this country. And it's like, yes, this country is a leech on America. Most of these far left countries can only get away with the policies they have because America is like the world police. If the American market crashed, the rest of the world crashes with it. So you can't look at these other countries as though they are independent and as though these policies are working in a vacuum. Because they're not. They're working because America foots the bill. And in other countries like Britain, you have people who are just being arrested for watching specific videos now. Like, I'm sorry if my video popped up and you saw it and you thought it was going to be a regular video. Oh, it's far-right propaganda. You go to jail now. Like, it's crazy. It should terrify us that people like this exist. And some of them probably vote. These comments that are just common sense, they got like 1/10 of the engagement, 1/10 the likes of these other comments that are just delusional. She got 2% of the vote when she ran in the Democratic primary. She was probably one of the least popular candidates in American history, and because she checks all of these identity politics boxes for you guys, you suddenly convince yourselves that she's great. Well, she's not. Full circle for this video, she lost. Get over it. So if you guys enjoyed this video, do all the other things. Did you know if I said subscribe, click the subscribe button, is that the right keyword? It makes the subscribe button glow, I think. Give it a like, subscribe, give it a like, subscribe. It's probably going to do nothing and then I look like an idiot, but allegedly it's supposed to work like that. If you guys want to see more videos like this, let me know down in the comments. I may try to make this not a regular thing, but a semi-regular thing. Maybe aiming towards like uploading this video on Tuesdays. The Tuesdays that I upload a short on Friday. I almost threw up. So that way, if you feel cheated that you didn't get a full video on Friday, guess what? You'll get a full video on Tuesday. But those are just sort of vague ideas right now, nothing set in stone. And for all I know, either I won't want to do this again or you guys will hate it and I'll never do it again. So in either case, let me know what you think. And this is the end of the video. I don't know how to sign off. I don't know how to end a video.